3 minutes ago, the illusion of a glittering, joyous coronation for Prince William was officially shattered. What Buckingham Palace has inadvertently revealed isn't a guest list or a crown design, but a truth far darker than anyone anticipated. A heartbreaking truth that the monarchy has fought to bury under a veneer of stability for the last 6 months. At precisely 4:15 a.m. this morning, while the heavy London fog still clung to the black iron gates of Kensington Palace, an internal document stamped Top Secret was leaked through an unsecured diplomatic channel. Its title was not festive. It was cold, concise, and ruthless. Operation Golden Orb, Protocol B. Accelerated accession due to incapacitation. To the outside world, the phrase William's coronation conjures images of flags, trumpets, and the dawn of a modern era. But for the closest courtiers working in the shadows of the palace corridors, this phrase has now become synonymous with a tragedy. This leak confirms what astute observers have feared. William's upcoming coronation is not a voluntary, joyful transfer of power. It is an emergency rescue mission. The 12-page leaked document details a stripped-back, somber, and hurried ceremony, designed not to celebrate, but to stabilize national psychology in the face of King Charles's rapid decline. A senior Whitehall source, who saw the original document early this morning, described it with a single word: heartbreaking. He stated, "This is not the plan for a new king ascending in glory. This is the plan for a son forced to step over his father's painful shadow just to save the crown." At Kensington Palace, where Prince William and Princess Kate reside, the atmosphere is reportedly thick and suffocating. Staff, waking early to prepare for the day, described an eerie silence draping the residence. There is no sound of children playing, no usual bustle of media aides. William is understood to have spent the entire night awake in his private study, the yellow light spilling from the window being the only sign of life in the darkness. He was not reviewing robe designs or coronation playlists. Instead, on his desk were detailed medical reports regarding his father and security risk assessments from the Commonwealth. A friend close to the Prince of Wales revealed, "William does not look at this coronation as a reward. He views it as a sentence." The heartbreaking truth the palace just exposed is that William never wanted the throne to come this way. He is being force-ripened, compelled to age a lifetime overnight. The most shocking detail in the leaked memo is the section analyzing the justification for triggering Protocol B. Unlike Protocol A, the traditional transition process following a monarch's natural passing due to old age, Protocol B is designed specifically for the situation of irreversible functional collapse of the incumbent sovereign, while still living. This means the palace is preparing the public to face an image of King Charles not just weakened, but completely incapable of fulfilling his symbolic role. William's coronation, therefore, will not carry the tone of succession, but the heavy air of a mandatory replacement. The lines in the text hold no emotion, but their weight is crushing. The coronation must be minimal, stripping away ostentatious celebratory elements, focusing on continuity and the solemnity of duty. The phrase, stripping away celebratory elements, is a knife to the heart of royalists. It confirms that William's greatest day will take place under a giant dark cloud of family tragedy. As the sun began to rise over the grey London sky, the truth became clear. The good news regarding the coronation that the media has been spinning was merely a facade covering the desperation inside the palace. William is not preparing to ascend a throne to rule a thriving kingdom. He is preparing to step up to shoulder a cracking institution, while having to watch his father fade right before his eyes. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. What took place during the closed-door meeting between William and senior advisors late last night is the real key to decoding this heartbreaking truth. And that is where our story continues. To understand the full gravity of the memo leaked this morning, we must go back 6 hours prior to the event that precipitated it at exactly 11:30 p.m. Last night, the lights in apartment 1A at Kensington Palace were blazing. This was not a social gathering. It was an emergency strategy session involving the Prince of Wales and 3 men whose names rarely appear in the press, but whose influence dictates the very survival of the monarchy. These were the men in grey suits, the senior constitutional liaisons who bridged the gap between Buckingham Palace and the government. Their presence in William's private residence at such an hour signaled one thing: the timeline had collapsed. The late spring transition mentioned in previous briefings was no longer an option. The situation had accelerated. Sources close to the household described the mood in that room as funereal. William stood by the fireplace, his back to the advisors, gripping a glass of water so tightly his knuckles were white. For months, he has played the role of the dutiful son, covering engagements, smiling for the cameras, and deflecting questions about the king's frailty. But last night, the mask finally slipped. According to a leak from a junior aide who was serving in the periphery, William turned to the senior advisor and asked a single devastating question that cut through the diplomatic fog. "Are you asking me to bury my father while he is still breathing?" The silence that followed was deafening. The advisor didn't flinch. He simply pushed a black folder across the mahogany table. Inside was not a medical chart, but a polling report from the Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, Jamaica. The data was catastrophic. It showed that public faith in the monarchy was tethered entirely to visibility. With King Charles absent and silent, the support for the institution was free-falling. The advisor's response to William was brutal in its honesty. He reportedly said, "Sir, we are not asking you to bury the king. We are asking you to save the crown. If the throne remains empty in the public eye for another 3 months, there may not be a kingdom left to inherit." This is the heartbreaking truth that the headlines are struggling to articulate today. The heartbreak is not just about a medical diagnosis. It is about the cruelty of the institution itself. It demands that William cease to be a grieving son and immediately become a ruthless sovereign. He is being forced to cannibalize his father's reign to ensure his own survival. It was in this moment, under the pressure of that midnight ultimatum, that the decision was made to draft Protocol B. But there was a twist that no one outside that room could have predicted. William refused to sign off on the plan unless one specific condition was met. He demanded that the king himself must give the order. He would not be seen as a usurper taking the crown from a sick man. He would only accept it as a burden passed down. This demand led to a secure, encrypted phone call to Highgrove House, where King Charles has been convalescing in isolation. The details of that call are perhaps the most tragic element of this entire saga. It wasn't a conversation between a monarch and his heir. It was a conversation between a father who knows his time is up and a son terrified of the weight about to crush him. Insiders suggest that Charles, despite his fading strength, was the one who comforted William. The king reportedly whispered, "The waiting is the hardest part. Do not make the country wait for me." It was an act of supreme sacrifice, a king authorizing his own obsolescence to protect the future of the dynasty. But as the meeting at Kensington adjourned, and the advisors filed out into the night, leaving William alone in the silence of his study, a new problem was already brewing. While William was wrestling with the moral weight of succession, his brother, Prince Harry, across the Atlantic, had received a very different version of events. And the reaction from Montecito was about to add a volatile layer of chaos to a transition already teetering on the edge of disaster. While Kensington Palace was suffocating under the weight of the future, a very different kind of storm was gathering 5,000 miles away in Montecito. The timing could not have been worse. Just as William accepted the mantle of a regency in all but name, the digital channels lighting up the phones of the Sussex team in California began to scream with alerts. Prince Harry did not receive the Protocol B memo. He was not consulted on the late spring timeline. He was not in the 1944 room, nor was he privy to the heart-wrenching midnight call between William and the king. Instead, the Duke of Sussex learned of his father's accelerating decline and his brother's imminent ascent the same way he has learned almost everything for the last 2 years, through a fragmented network of sympathetic whispers and the brutal clarity of media leaks. Sources suggest that the version of events that reached California was distorted, stripped of the nuance and sorrow that permeated London. To Harry, this didn't look like a tragic necessity. It looked like a coup. From the outside, the accelerated accession appeared to be the institution finally closing ranks, using the king's frailty to cement William's power base and permanently exile the spare before he could make amends. The reaction inside the Montecito mansion was described by one insider as incandescent. For Harry, the heartbreaking truth revealed today is double-edged. It is the realization that his father is fading, coupled with the crushing knowledge that the door to reconciliation is being bolted shut by the very machinery preparing to crown his brother. King Charles was the only buffer left between Harry and the cold steel of the institution. Once Charles is gone, or effectively removed from power, Harry knows he will be dealing solely with William. And as last night's midnight meeting proved, William is no longer just a brother. He is the crown incarnate, ruthless in his defense of the realm. But silence is not a currency the Sussexes trade in. Within hours of the Protocol B leak, palace aides in London reported a spike in anxiety regarding the California variable. The fear is palpable that Harry, feeling cornered and kept in the dark about his own father's true condition, might lash out, not with a book this time, but with a statement, a demand to be seen, or worse, a sudden, unannounced flight to London that would turn the carefully choreographed transition into a media circus. There are already whispers that Meghan is viewing this through a different lens, a strategic one. If William's coronation is to be a stripped-back, somber affair, the presence or glaring absence of the Sussexes becomes the defining narrative. They hold the power of distraction. A single interview, a single photo release, could derail the palace's attempt to stabilize national psychology. As dawn broke over London, the palace communications team was fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, managing the narrative of a dying king. On the other, monitoring the silence from California, waiting for the inevitable counterstrike. And they didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, a notification arrived at Buckingham Palace from a major U.S. television network. It wasn't a request for comment. It was a heads-up regarding a special report being prepared, citing sources close to the Duke. The monarchy was trying to manage a transition of power, but they had forgotten that grief, when mixed with exile, turns volatile. William had silenced his emotions to save the crown, but Harry was about to weaponize his to demand the truth. The coronation plans were already fragile, held together by protocol and prayers. Now, they were about to face the one thing Protocol B could not account for: the unpredictable rage of a son who feels he has been erased from his father's final chapter. If Prince Harry represents the volatile fire threatening the transition from the outside, Queen Camilla has become the silent ash crumbling from within. While the media frenzy focused on the Protocol B leak and William's midnight ultimatum, a far quieter, yet equally devastating drama was unfolding behind the beige walls of Clarence House. For decades, Camilla Parker Bowles fought a war of attrition. She endured the hatred of a nation, the scorn of the press, and the cold shoulder of the establishment, all for one goal: to stand beside Charles as his equal. She succeeded. But the cruel irony of the Protocol B memo is that it confirms her victory was a hollow one. History will record her not as the matriarch of a new Carolean era, but as the queen of a short winter, a consort whose reign was defined almost entirely by the slow, public fading of her husband. Sources close to the queen consort describe her state this morning as shattered but stoic. Unlike William, who views the acceleration of power as a burden of duty, for Camilla, this is a dismantling of her life's work. When the late spring timeline was confirmed in that 4 a.m. memo, it signaled the effective end of her public purpose. Once William ascends, whether as Prince Regent or King Camilla's influence evaporates. She transitions instantly from the central figure of the court to a widow in waiting, sidelined by a new court that is younger, sharper, and notoriously cooler towards her. The heartbreaking aspect for Camilla isn't just the loss of status, it is the isolation. Reports from the household suggest that William has been respectful but distant. His focus is entirely on the operation. In the brutal calculus of monarchy, the queen consort is a supporting character to the sovereign. If the sovereign falls, the support structure is dismantled to make way for the new principals, William and Kate. At 9 a.m., just hours after the leak, a symbolic moment occurred that went unnoticed by the cameras outside. A senior king's messenger arrived at Clarence House with the daily red box, the government papers requiring the king's attention. For the first time in his reign, Charles did not receive it. Instead, the box was redirected, under new standing orders, to Kensington Palace. Camilla reportedly watched this transfer from the morning room. It was a silent administrative act, but it carried the violence of a coup. It was the physical manifestation of the power draining away from her husband. She knows better than anyone that once the red boxes stop coming, the reign is effectively over, regardless of what the official titles say. Meanwhile, the leak of Protocol B has begun to metabolize in the British public consciousness. The shock is turning into a strange, somber pragmatism. The public is not angry, they are grieving, but they are grieving the idea of Charles, the prince who waited forever, rather than the king he barely got to be. The narrative on the streets of London is shifting rapidly from "Long live the king" to "God save the prince." This shift in public sentiment is exactly what the men in grey suits wanted to engineer with their controlled leaks. They are preparing the psychological ground for William. But they miscalculated one critical variable. They assumed the king's decline would follow a linear, predictable path, a slow fade, until late spring. They were wrong. At 10:45 a.m., a convoy of unmarked medical vehicles, usually reserved for the most discreet emergency transfers, was spotted leaving the rear entrance of Highgrove, heading not towards London, but towards a specialized medical facility in the Midlands. The Protocol B timeline was based on a late spring transition, but the sudden movement of these vehicles suggests that late spring might be a luxury the Crown no longer has. The timeline isn't just accelerating, it is collapsing, and William, still grappling with the moral weight of his midnight decision, is about to receive a phone call that will demand he step up not in months, but perhaps in days. The timeline died on the M5 motorway. For weeks, the men in grey suits had pinned the survival of the monarchy on the late spring strategy, a slow, dignified drawdown of duties that would allow the public to adjust to the idea of a new king. But at 11:15 a.m., as the convoy of unmarked medical vehicles sped south under police escort, that strategy was incinerated. The movement was supposed to be a sterile transfer, invisible to the public eye. But in the age of digital surveillance, nothing is invisible. Within minutes, grainy footage captured by a dashboard camera on a passing truck began circulating on encrypted channels used by the London press pack. The license plates were blurred, but the configuration was unmistakable. Royal Protection Squad outriders, a mobile intensive care unit, and the king's personal limousine, empty in the front passenger seat, blinds drawn in the back. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere shifted from managed anxiety to controlled panic. The Protocol B memo, leaked only hours earlier, was now effectively a historical document, rendered obsolete by the speed of biological reality. Aides were seen actually running across the forecourt, a breach of decorum that signaled the severity of the crisis. The question was no longer about transitioning duties. It was about whether the king would survive the journey to London to formally sign the Regency papers. At Kensington Palace, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't an advisor. It was the king's personal physician, calling from inside the lead vehicle of the convoy. The message delivered to Prince William was brief, stripped of all medical jargon, and terrifying in its finality. "The window has closed, sir. We are entering the endgame." William, who had spent the morning steeling himself for a transition of months, was now staring into the abyss of hours. Sources close to the prince say he went pale, the color draining from his face, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, crushing weight of realization. There would be no apprenticeship, there would be no gradual handover. He was being thrown onto the throne without a safety net. It was in this moment that Kate, the Princess of Wales, stepped out of the shadows. While William stood frozen by the news, Kate reportedly took the phone from his hand and issued the orders that the future king could not yet voice. She instructed the household to lock down the children's school, to recall the press secretaries, and to prepare the black outfits. The mourning and emergency attire kept on standby for immediate transport. Kate's intervention was the steel spine the moment required. She understood what William, in his grief, could not yet process. The monarchy does not pause for heartache. If Charles was incapacitating, the vacuum of power had to be filled instantly, or the vultures, both political and media, would circle. She was no longer just protecting her husband. She was securing the dynasty. By noon, the convoy breached the perimeter of London. The sirens were silent, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But the speed of the vehicles told a different story. They were not heading to Buckingham Palace. They were heading to King Edward VII's hospital. This diversion was the final signal. Going to the palace means business as usual. Going to the hospital means a medical emergency. The late spring narrative was dead. The abdication narrative was now morphing into something far more volatile, a constitutional precipice. The Regency Act, a piece of legislation the palace had desperately tried to avoid invoking because it signals instability, was now being dusted off in Whitehall. As the hospital doors swallowed the king's stretcher, shielded by a wall of umbrellas and armed officers, the world outside held its breath. The palace press office went dark. No emails, no calls, no comment. Just a terrifying, monolithic silence. But inside the corridors of power, the machinery was grinding into a new gear. William was summoned to the Privy Council. The time for negotiation was over. The prince was about to be asked to do the one thing a son never wants to do: sign the paper that declares his father history. While the convoy was still cooling in the hospital loading bay, the true center of gravity had shifted to a windowless room deep within the cabinet office in Whitehall. This was where the physical reality of the king's illness met the cold, unyielding machinery of the British Constitution. At 1 p.m., Prince William arrived. He did not enter through the front door where the press pack was already swarming, hungry for a glimpse of grief. He entered through a secure underground logistical tunnel, the same route used for wartime contingencies. The symbolism was stark. The prince was not arriving to visit a sick father. He was arriving to execute a command. Waiting for him were the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chief Justice, and the Speaker of the House of Commons, the three councillors of state required to witness the invocation of the Regency Act. The mood in the room was sterile, stripped of the warmth and deference usually afforded to royalty. There were no bows, no handshakes, just a single document made of heavy vellum sitting on a green baize table, the instrument of delegation. To the public, this is just legal paperwork. But for William, staring at the document under the harsh fluorescent lights, it represented a profound psychological violence. This paper did not just transfer power, it legally declared his father incapacitated. By signing it, William was effectively agreeing with the state that King Charles III was no longer a person capable of thought or command, but merely a biological entity to be managed. Sources inside the room describe a moment of hesitation that lasted an eternity. William picked up the pen, his hand hovering over the signature line. This was the heartbreaking truth in its rawest form. He wasn't just saving the monarchy. He was usurping the man who had raised him. It was a patricide of power, sanctioned by law and demanded by duty. A witness reported that the Lord Chancellor broke the silence, speaking softly but with absolute finality. "Sir, the government cannot function without a signature. The delay is becoming a constitutional crisis." William closed his eyes, exhaled a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the last 6 months, and signed. The scratch of the nib against the parchment was the only sound in the room. With that ink, the reign of King Charles III entered a twilight state, technically ongoing, but functionally over. William stood up, leaving the document on the table. He did not look back at it. He had walked into the room as a worried son. He walked out as the Prince Regent, the Shadow King, holding the full authority of the crown in a grip he never wanted. But as William emerged from the underground bunker and stepped into the waiting armored Jaguar, the crisis metastasized. The sterile transfer of power was complete, but the containment of the narrative had failed catastrophically. At 1:45 p.m., a staffer at the hospital, likely a low-level administrator or a porter, leaked a single, unverified detail to a tabloid editor. It wasn't about the Regency. It wasn't about the timeline. It was about the specific medical equipment being rushed into the king's private wing. The leak claimed that a ventilator unit had been requested. If true, this changed everything. A ventilator implies not just incapacitation, but a fight for life. The late spring transition was now a fantasy. The regency might only last days. As William's car sped towards Kensington Palace to reunite with Kate, the news broke across every screen in London. The public wasn't just preparing for a new king anymore. They were preparing for a funeral. And William, now holding the powers of the sovereign, had to decide whether to tell the world the whole truth or continue the palace's legacy of silence until the very bitter end. The leak of the word ventilator did not just break the news cycle. It broke the psychological dam holding the nation together. By 2:30 p.m., the crowd outside King Edward VII's hospital had swelled from a few dozen curiosity seekers to a mass of thousands. The silence that usually accompanies royal health scares was replaced by a low, anxious hum, the sound of a city bracing for a state funeral before the death has even been announced. Inside Kensington Palace, the fortress mode that Princess Kate had initiated earlier in the day was now fully operational. While William returned from Whitehall carrying the invisible but crushing weight of the Regency, Kate was fighting a different kind of war, a war of optics and protection. At 3 p.m., a garment bag was delivered to the rear entrance of apartment 1A. It bore no label, but every member of the household staff knew exactly what was inside. These were the black outfits, the mourning attire, mandated by Operation Menai Bridge. For years, these clothes hung in the back of wardrobes, theoretical and distant. Today, they were being steamed and pressed for immediate use. This is the heartbreaking truth that no official statement will ever capture. The image of the Princess of Wales standing in her dressing room, inspecting the hem of a black dress, while her husband, the Shadow King, sat in the next room, head in his hands, trying to process the fact that he had just signed his father's professional death warrant. Kate's role in this crisis has become the single most vital component of the monarchy's survival. Sources close to the couple say she made a decisive call at 3:30 p.m. to the children's school. She would not allow Prince George to be pulled out early, despite the security risks. She insisted on maintaining the routine until the very last second. She understands, with a terrifying clarity, that once George sees his father in that black tie, his childhood is effectively over. He ceases to be just a boy and becomes the heir to the heir, thrust into the same cycle of duty and public grief that broke both his father and grandfather. Meanwhile, the palace press office was in total collapse. The ventilator leak had rendered their prepared statements useless. They couldn't issue a denial because it was true. They couldn't issue a confirmation because it would trigger a market crash and a constitutional panic. So they chose the only option left: total radio silence. But silence, in a vacuum of information, breeds terror. International broadcasters began running retrospectives of King Charles's life, the kind of pre-bituary packages usually reserved for the final hours. To watch the television was to watch a reign being dismantled in real time. At 4 p.m., William finally emerged from his study. He looked aged. The transformation that the Protocol B memo predicted the force ripening of the heir had happened in less than 12 hours. He walked into the drawing room where Kate was waiting. There were no words exchanged, just a look. It was the look of two people who realized the late spring was a lie they had told themselves to sleep at night. The winter was here. And then, the phone rang again. It wasn't the hospital. It wasn't the government. It was a secure line from the United States. The California variable had stopped being a threat and started being a reality. Prince Harry was on the line. He wasn't calling to ask for updates anymore. He was calling to say he was on a plane. The men in gray suits had feared this moment more than anything. A rogue duke, fueled by grief and exclusion, descending into a delicate constitutional transfer, the chaos was no longer just medical or political. It was now deeply, destructively personal. The palace walls could keep the press out, but they couldn't keep the family fracture from tearing the transition apart. By 5 p.m., the narrative of the crisis had shifted from the ground to the sky. Flight tracking websites crashed globally as millions of people tuned in to follow a single private jet charting a course from California to London. The California variable was no longer a threat. It was a projectile hurtling towards the British capital at 600 miles an hour. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood was frantic. The men in grey suits had plans for funerals, plans for coronations, and plans for terrorist attacks. But they had no plan for this. A grieving, estranged duke, arriving in the middle of a constitutional transfer of power, unvetted, unscripted, and uncontrollable. The fear was not about what Harry would do, but about what he would see. The palace had spent months constructing a sanitized version of the king's condition, the late spring narrative. If Harry walked into that hospital room and saw the ventilator, saw the tubes, saw the reality of the incapacitation William had just signed off on, the carefully curated lie would shatter. Harry has no loyalty to the men in grey suits. If he felt his father had been mishandled, or that the severity of the illness had been hidden from him, he would not stay silent. He would burn the narrative to the ground. This placed Prince William in an impossible position. As the newly signed regent, the authority to grant or deny access to the sovereign now rested solely with him. It was his first executive decision as the Shadow King, and it was the most painful one imaginable. He had to choose between being a brother, opening the door to a fellow mourner, or being a protector of the crown, keeping the loose cannon outside the blast zone. Sources indicate that at 5:30 p.m., a secure message was sent to the security detail awaiting the plane at Farnborough Airport. The instructions were strict. The Duke of Sussex was to be transported not to the hospital, but to a holding location, likely Clarence House, or a secure, safe house. The message was clear: no direct access until the regent approves. It was a cold, bureaucratic move, but in the eyes of the palace, it was necessary survival. They could not risk a shouting match at the deathbed of a monarch. Back at King Edward VII's hospital, the medical reality was darkening. The ventilator leak had forced the doctors to change tactics. They could no longer hide the machinery. They could only hide the king. The windows of the private wing were blacked out. Police presence tripled. It looked less like a medical facility and more like a fortress under siege. Inside that fortress, Queen Camilla sat alone. The woman who had been the third person in a marriage was now the only person in the room. She was witnessing the final irony of her life. She had fought the world to be queen, but in these final, desperate hours, the crown was stripping her of her husband. The protocols, the regency papers, the security cordons, they were all mechanisms of the state designed to extract the monarch from the man. Charles belonged to history now, not to her. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the Mall, the tension reached a breaking point. The plane was beginning its descent. The regent was barricaded in Kensington. The Queen was isolated in the hospital, and the press pack, sensing the collision of these three volatile forces, turned their lenses towards the tarmac. The heartbreaking truth was about to spill out onto the runway. The exile was returning, not to a family reunion, but to a crime scene of power. The wheels of the Duke's jet hit the tarmac at Farnborough at 6:42 p.m., screeching against the runway in a landing that felt less like an arrival and more like an invasion. For Prince Harry, stepping off that plane was supposed to be a moment of reclamation, a son rushing to his father's side, defying the institution that had pushed him away. But as the cabin door opened into the biting English wind, he found that the institution had arrived first. There was no royal convoy waiting. There were no police outriders to sweep him through traffic. Instead, waiting at the bottom of the stairs were 3 black Range Rovers and 2 protection officers from a unit Harry didn't recognize. They were not there to escort him to the king. They were there to contain him. The heartbreaking truth of this moment cannot be overstated. In the eyes of the newly activated regency, the king's second son was now classified as a security variable, a potential leak that had to be managed rather than a family member to be embraced. Sources on the ground report a heated exchange on the tarmac. Harry demanded to be taken directly to King Edward VII's hospital. The officers, operating under strict instructions signed by the Prince Regent only an hour earlier, refused. This was William's iron ring in action. He had drawn a circle around the dying monarch, and Harry was standing outside of it. The decision to delay Harry's access was ruthless, but from a constitutional perspective, it was logical. William could not risk a shouting match, a recording device, or a breakdown in the sterile corridor of the intensive care unit. The crown protects the sovereign's dignity above the son's grief. Harry was driven not to his father's bedside, but to a secure royal property in London, effectively placed in a diplomatic quarantine. He was told he would see the king when the medical team deems it stable. It was a polite, bureaucratic lie. Everyone knew there would be no stabilization. They were simply running out the clock. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted from crisis to vigil. The medical machinery that had been the subject of the afternoon's leak was now doing the work that the king's body could not. Queen Camilla had not left the room for 6 hours. William arrived at 7:15 p.m., entering through a service door to avoid the hysteria out front. For the first time in months, the two factions of the palace, the Queen Consort and the Prince Regent, were in the same room, but they were not united by strategy anymore. They were united by the terrifying sound of the monitors. The transition was no longer a political abstract in a Protocol B folder. It was happening in the rhythm of a failing heartbeat. At 8 p.m., the BBC News presenters changed into black ties. This is the signal Britain knows well. It is the visual code that precedes the end of an era. The programming schedules were quietly cleared. The upbeat evening shows were replaced by somber documentaries about the king's life and environmental work. The country looked at the screens and understood. The late spring was tonight. Inside the secure safe house, Harry watched the same news coverage as the rest of the world. The irony was devastating. He had flown 5,000 miles to say goodbye, only to be trapped in a gilded cage a few miles away, watching his father's reign end on television. The anger that had fueled his flight was now turning into a cold, hollow despair. He realized then that Protocol B wasn't just about succession, it was about exclusion. Back at the hospital, the lead physician turned to William and nodded. It was the signal. The medical intervention was no longer preserving life. It was only prolonging the inevitable. The time had come to let the king go. William, faced with the heaviest decision of his life, had to authorize the removal of the very machinery that the press had leaked hours ago. The pen he had used to sign the Regency Act was still in his pocket. Now, he needed his voice. He gave the order not as a son, but as the head of the family, the protector of the dignity of the crown. The machines were silenced. The room fell quiet, and outside, the wind howled through the streets of London, carrying with it the invisible, irreversible turning of the page. At 8:12 p.m., the silence in the private wing of King Edward VII's hospital was absolute. There were no more alarms, no more rushing nurses, no more desperate negotiations with biology. King Charles III, the man who waited 70 years to serve, had completed his final duty. He had let go. In that sterile room, the transition of power happened not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a subtle, terrifying shift in gravity. The moment the king's breath ceased, the invisible weight of the crown lifted from the bed and settled instantly, crushing onto the shoulders of the man standing beside it. William did not move. He did not cry. He simply stared at his father's face, realizing that the late spring had been stolen from them both. The heartbreaking truth that the palace had revealed throughout this day was fully realized in this final second. The truth wasn't about illness or protocols. It was about the cold brutality of the institution. It demands that a son cannot simply grieve his father. He must immediately assess him as a predecessor. Queen Camilla was the first to break the stillness. In a gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 years of history, she stood up, wiped her tears, and slowly bowed her head to William. It was the death of her marriage and the birth of his reign in a single motion. She was no longer the wife of the sovereign. She was the Dowager Queen, a relic of an era that had just ended. Across London, in the secure safe house, the phone rang for Prince Harry. It was William. The conversation was brief, lasting less than 30 seconds. Sources say there was no reconciliation, no warmth, just the delivery of the news. He is gone. Harry had flown across an ocean to say goodbye, but the iron ring of the palace had ensured he missed the moment. He arrived in London as an exile, and he would leave as a ghost, haunting the periphery of a family he could no longer touch. At 8:30 p.m., the notice was posted on the black gates of Buckingham Palace. The crowd fell silent as they read the words. The era of Charles was over before it had truly begun. The short winter had passed, and the cold spring of William V had arrived. But as the Union Jack was lowered to half-mast, the real story began to emerge. The Protocol B memo, the midnight ultimatums, the ventilator leaks, they were all part of a desperate scramble to save the institution from collapsing along with the king. William had saved the crown, but the cost was the destruction of everything human remaining within it. He had signed his father's regency papers, locked his brother out of the deathbed, and forced his wife into the black mourning dress before the heart had even stopped beating. The monarchy survives because it is ruthless. That is the lesson of today. The fairy tale is dead. What remains is a machine, polished and powerful, fueled by the sacrifice of the people trapped inside it. As William left the hospital, stepping into the blinding flash of 10,000 cameras, he looked different. The force ripening was complete. The eyes that looked back at the world were cold, steel, and utterly alone. He is the king the world wanted, but he is also the man who had to destroy his own family to get there. The question now is not whether William is ready to rule. The question is whether the monarchy can survive the coldness of the reign that is about to begin. This is the end of the Charles era, and this is the heartbreaking truth about how it really finished. If you think William made the right choice to put the crown before his brother, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to understand the next phase of this royal crisis, make sure you are subscribed, because the storm has only just begun.